Okay, so I'd like to begin this session by building on the acknowledgements of country that we've already heard today, but with a particular reference to where we are today and in relation to the topic that I'll be sharing. And to do this, I invite everyone to soften and close your eyes, or to keep them downcast, and to take a deep breath, to focus your mind on the land where we meet today. This beautiful patch of earth where for more than 60,000 years, Aboriginal people lived in harmony with the land and spirit. The wetlands, hills and valleys and the mighty river here offered an abundance of animal and plant food for the local Noongar people. For eons, Aboriginal women birthed their babies onto this sacred land, and their children grew, knowing how to live in deep connection with their kin, culture and country. Death was a part of life, and grief was a powerful communal activity guided by ritual and relationships. Despite the tragedy of recent history and the impact of the imposition of white fella worldviews, these traditions and their wisdom remain strong in the hearts and lives of Noongar people today. Let us take a moment to honour the strength and resilience that this has taken, and to offer deep compassion for the grief of Indigenous people here and around the world for the losses to their people, their cultures and their lands. Before we open our eyes, I invite us all to acknowledge and feel into the current surge of grief that's present in response to the murder of 15-year-old Noongar Yamaji boy Cassius Turvey less than 1 month ago. For a moment longer, soften your eyes and then open them as you return them and your attention to this room, to this day and to each other. The reason why I wanted to take these extra moments is because I lived and worked in a remote Aboriginal community in the early 90s. I was a young mother at the time with 2 sons who attended the local school, where the class size varied from the 2 of them if there was a funeral on in another country, in another community, or up to 40 if families had families visiting. Of the regular class of about 20 or so students, barely a third are alive today. Closing the gap in the Narrandera lands is sadly way off target. For Australian Aboriginal cultures and communities, death was, and always will be, recognised as a part of life, an undeniable, often cruel, and now an ever-present part of life. So my topic today is about death denial in Western cultures and who cares. And I'd like to explore this through sharing the story of the Grief Centre of Western Australia, in particular the challenges and our response to recent events. The Grief Centre was established in 2014 to fill a gap in grief support services. After the sudden death of a close relative, our founder, Chris Richardson, was astonished to be unable to find any support to make sense of the pain and tragedy. Over the last 8 years, the Grief Centre has quietly and steadily built a range of specialist, community-based grief support services, each designed to ease the heartache of grief and loss. The centre now runs weekly support groups, individual and family counselling, a choir, a range of creative and therapeutic workshops, much-loved annual events, grief literacy training, and more recently, critical incidents response. Additionally, regular grant-funded time-limited projects are run, which currently include a Walking with Grief program, grief and resilience training for first responders and communities affected by recent bushfires, research on writing for wellbeing in association with Curtin University, and a business development grant to boost the centre's capacity and reach and to achieve financial sustainability. Beyond our counselling, corporate training and grant-funded positions, the Grief Centre has relied solely on the skills, commitment and vision of volunteers to sustain and grow the organisation and build a dedicated, caring community. During the peak of COVID, the COVID crisis, numerous, often urgent calls were made to the Grief Centre from workplaces seeking advice on how best to support their clients, staff, students, patients and/or community members who were struggling to cope with the changes that came with the pandemic and the impact of how it was being publicised, perceived and managed. These inquiries came from a cross-section of the public, private and community sectors, including aged care facilities, private businesses, legal firms, paramedics, prison, and from all levels of education, especially tertiary institutions. A call also came from the WA Health Department inquiring about counselling for people not coping well in quarantine. This sharp increase for advice and support in response to unwelcome change included real and potential death and is a society-wide recognition of the same gap that inspired the establishment of the Grief Centre in the first place. Grief was suddenly present everywhere, but with nowhere to go. To the best of our capacity and within the constraints of government mandates and service adaptability to going online, the Grief Centre quickly responded to the inquiries. Interestingly, many of the fraught initial calls were never followed up by employers, due possibly to a reluctance to prioritise access to such support and/or to offer the centre payment. Like other employers and service providers across the state, the community was also faced with the invidious decision of interpreting the COVID-19 government mandates, which were set to limit public access to specified services by employees and volunteers who were choosing not to vaccinate. Sorry, I'll say that again so there's a little clarity here. So the government mandates, which were set to limit public access to specified services and by employees and volunteers who were choosing not to vaccinate. The centre was acutely aware of the impact of service closure for the grieving community, given the value of our weekly support groups for our members and the knowledge that many of our older clients were not able to access services online. As a health promotion charity, unlike healthcare services, the Grief Centre was technically at liberty to keep our doors open and not limit entry to those with specified vaccination status. However, the centre was deeply concerned about how remaining open might be interpreted by members of our own community and the sector itself, and so our decision was to limit access. As an inclusive provider, service provider with care, connection and community, our core values, the centre was also concerned about the intense grief arising for people who, for whatever reason, were choosing not to vaccinate. For these people, lifelong friendships and family bonds disappeared overnight. Jobs were lost, businesses closed, travel restricted, and access to loved ones in aged care and health facilities was limited, and many of these restrictions continue today. With grief spiralling across the community, our services were required more than any time before, yet the centre was left with the quandary of how to deliver this vital support. When grief is left unacknowledged and unattended to, and the fear of death left to limit our ability to face and embrace both the wonder and the despair that comes as we live life, our capacity to function as an open, compassionate and inclusive society is compromised. In a death-denying culture, grief is by default often left unacknowledged and unresolved. And the impact of this accounts for many mental health issues and dysfunction in our society, including suicide, crime, relationship breakdown, and homelessness, to name a few. Evidence also indicates that most people in prisons have unresolved grief in their history, mainly from childhood. Absenteeism and presenteeism. When an employee is present but unable to focus on their work, occurs in the workplace when staff or management are unable or unwilling to acknowledge grief and loss. In the US, the financial cost in the workplace of grief in the workplace has been quantified by the Grief Index from the Grief Recovery Institute with a pre-pandemic value of 100 billion US dollars. I couldn't find anything similar in Australia. In comparison to the cost and the social ills that come with death denial and unresolved grief, building grief and death literacy is a relatively simple, painless, and indeed a heartening exercise. At a recent Death Cafe hosted by the Grief Centre, an attendee remarked how uplifted and liberated she felt after sharing conversations and connection around the subject of death, dying and grief. In an article on grief literacy presented in 2020 at the 30th meeting of the International Workgroup on Death, Dying and Bereavement, the researchers stated that they anticipate the collateral benefits of grief literacy will include increases in collective well-being, resilience, community cohesion, social fabric, and emotional competence, and reductions in loneliness, isolation, struggle, stigma, and suicide. In January this year, The Lancet released a report titled "The Value of Death, Bringing Death Back to Life." This internationally researched paper was commissioned by The Lancet in recognition that death in the 21st century is not what it used to be, or how it is now understood. Healthcare and individuals struggle to accept the inevitability of death. Additionally, the roles of families and communities have receded as death and dying have become unfamiliar and skills, traditions and knowledge have been lost. The report states that with COVID, death is prominent in the daily media and health systems have been overwhelmed. People have died the ultimate medicalised death, often alone but for masked staff in hospitals and ICUs, unable to communicate with family except electronically. The situation has further fueled the fear of death, reinforcing the idea of healthcare services as the custodians of death. And a key and urgent answer to this dilemma, The Lancet suggests, is community. I don't know where I first heard this, but the imperative to build community as if our lives depend on it is something I and the Grief Centre have come to resonate with quite deeply. Changes and challenges of all kinds seem to be on the rise in the environment, with our technology, with the gap between the rich and the rest of us, in the convoluted, careless and impersonal systems in government and corporations, with life in general, and perhaps one of our society's greatest challenges is still yet to come, the impact of our ageing population. Thankfully, many governments and NGOs around the world recognise that our health systems will not be able to cope with the grey tsunami, and this has birthed a compassionate communities movement that is designed to re-empower the community with the knowledge, skills and values to embrace the challenges and the gifts that come with caring for those who are dying. We will need each other. Indeed, we need each other now, not only to be at the bedside as our dear ones die, but also to provide care and understanding when someone in our family or our community is gripped by grief. Traditionally, and in Indigenous cultures everywhere, grief was never experienced privately. It was always a communal concern. For millennia, people gathered in sanctified places with the specific intent to welcome, express and honour their grief and other changes happening in the world around them. In recognition of this, the Grief Centre designed and prototyped a model for community grief gatherings. With a grant from the City of Stirling, these gatherings were launched for the public earlier this year. They are simple, non-sectarian occasions held in safe and nurturing places. And the first was held mid-lockdown outside in a park overlooking a beautiful wetland. All who wished to acknowledge and attend to their grief were welcome, regardless of vaccine status. Testimonials prove these gatherings to powerfully lift the heartache of grief, if only for a moment, while building care, community and connection. On the last day of last month, thousands of people of all creeds and colours gathered on a football oval where 15 fire pits burned to honour each year of the life of Cassius Turvey. Mark Kickett, Cassius's uncle and Uniting Church Reverend, addressed the crowd saying, "It is time now for us to look deep into our own soul to understand what needs to take place if there is going to be healing and a new way forward, if there's an opportunity for us to truly be one nation. Your presence here tells me strongly that this is exactly where we're at, and it's time for us to speak into that space, to our politicians and to our parliaments. It's the time for the voice of Aboriginal and Islander First Nations people to stand up and to be heard and counted." At the heart of the Compassionate Communities model and the principles that underpin the Closing the Gap Partnership Agreement is the call for equal partners in the design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of services. The time is over for the professionals, the politicians and the policymakers to deny the role and wisdom of lived experience in the community. The Lancet Commission states that healthcare professionals cannot substitute for the sense of coherence, the rituals and traditions, nor the long-term mutual support that families and communities bring to people who are grieving and dying. As Atul Gawande points out in his book, Being Mortal, the experiment of making mortality a medical experience is just decades old. It is young, and the evidence is failing. Despite the dominance of health professionals in the death space, it is estimated that they are at the bedside only 5% of the time, with family, friends and community members present to care for the dying, but with vastly diminished knowledge and capabilities relative to previous generations. As we find our way with death again, death doulas are stepping into this space to guide and to offer guide and support. And in recognition of this, the Centre makes our venue available for death doula trainings and regular meetups. As the Lancet article says, rebalancing death and dying, oops, not that one. Rebalancing death and dying will depend on changes across the death systems, the many interrelated social, cultural, economic, religious and political factors that determine how death, dying and bereavement are understood, experienced and managed. I'd like to end where I started today. Just as they have during the COVID pandemic, the disadvantaged and powerless suffer most from the imbalance in care when dying and grieving. Income, education, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation and other factors influence how much people suffer in death systems and the capacity they possess to change them. I'd like to end by going back to where I started, by returning to my time in the Narrandera lands in the early 90s. My interest to spend time there was inspired by my deep concern for Narrandera women being removed from their communities to birth. Having birthed my own children at home, like my mother and all of our maternal descendants before us, I was shocked to realise that my Narrandera sister-in-law was forced to leave her kin, country and culture to birth in squeaky clean delivery suites in regional hospitals. No smell of the campfire, no starry sky, no familiar language or food, no female kin, no rite of passage. research grants, conference presentations with the Ngarrindjatjara women, numerous submissions, meetings, papers, and an SBS documentary later, and nothing changed except for more restrictive health policies in response to increased ill health of birthing women and their babies. After decades of working in support of informed birth choices, it is no coincidence that I find myself now in the death space. The challenges that women and their families face as they prepare for birth are not at all dissimilar to what we face at the end of life. Both the transition and into and out of life and the grief that comes as we live life are multifaceted experiences that demand deep care, attention, and respect. Being well informed, well prepared, and well supported vastly improve these experiences, and yet so few people prioritise these ahead of time. Grief, birth, and death also demand a place within, not excluded from, community, where they can be honoured and embraced as key life events. At the Grief Centre of Western Australia, the comment we hear most when people find their way to our services is, "If only I knew about you before." Thank you.
Thanks. Veterans. Going to scroll just with the arrows. Okay. I should warn you, I've got a bit of a sore back. So if I'm standing like this, it's not a statement. It's just it's just pain. So I'm Kathy. I'm going to be presenting on the McCusker Centre for Citizenship model, and I'm going to be outlining how we combine community service with social justice education with the aim of helping students to develop a critical consciousness. So I would like to, no, it's not going. Is it? Yeah, I was pushing that one. Now? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'd also like to begin with an acknowledgement and to acknowledge that this campus and this city is situated on land of the Whadjuk Noongar. We recognise the Whadjuk Noongar people as the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty. Pay our respects to them and their culture, past and so I'm just going to briefly tell you what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to describe who we are, first of all, and what we do. And then I'll try and contextualise this within some of the pedagogical literature around critical service learning, as well as some of the academic literature around critical consciousness. And I'll finish up by sharing some of the thoughts of our students and partners. And I should be clear that we are in the process of putting together some research to actually back this up. This is giving you some of the foundational stuff. So just to start with, I want to begin with this definition of critical consciousness, which states that critical consciousness refers to an individual's awareness of oppressive systemic forces, as well as a sense of efficacy and engagement in action against oppression. So it's based on the work of Paulo Freire. I'm sure some of you have heard of him. He's a Brazilian philosopher and educator. And this notion of critical consciousness has been widely accepted as a fundamental requirement for social change. So people need to engage with and they need to understand structures of oppression if they are to be able to transform them. So at the McCusker Centre for Citizenship here at UWA, we take a critical service learning approach to introduce students to community service. And our aim is to empower students to bring about social change within their communities. And part of the way we do this is to assist them to develop their own critical consciousness. So I want to start with just some background on who we are. So the McCusker Centre for Citizenship, it's the first of its kind in Australia. It was founded with an endowment from the McCusker Charitable Foundation. It started in 2015. And it offers internships with not-for-profit, community and government organisations, locally, regionally, and we do have some global ones as well, a couple of global partnerships. They're offered as an academic unit involving 100 hours of project work within the community, with students' applied experience supplemented with classes and assessments that contextualise and prompt critical reflection about the drivers of social disadvantage and the need for active civic engagement to tackle these. And we're not based in any faculty or school. The internship's taken by students from across the university, and it's an elective unit. So it's not mandatory. They're not being forced to do this unless they do decide to do the minor. And I should say as well, it's an ungraded pass-fail unit. So they're not being graded. It's about what we're trying to get them to achieve. It's not necessarily something that can be measured. It's about these intangible learnings. We partner with over 400 partners now, community, government and non-government organisations. We've had over 2,000 students and over 222,000 hours of community service. We've actually got 200 students doing their internship right now, just started this week, which is really exciting. And feedback is overwhelmingly positive. And underpinning our work is the belief that engaged citizenship is increasingly important in a world that is global, complex and connected. And as social injustice and inequality deepens, both locally and globally, a clear understanding of the systemic drivers of social disadvantage and a commitment to social justice is in order to overcome social need, is essential. And we can't kind of stress it enough. So then thinking about service learning. So service learning has become quite an established practice within educational institutions who wish to inculcate practices of civic responsibility within their student cohort. And it's being described as a process of reflective of the experience education in which students learn civic or social responsibility through a scholarship of community engagement that embodies the principles of reciprocity. So there's evidence that these activities, they hold real value for students, and that service participation has numerous benefits for students, including things like academic performance, values, self-efficacy, and leadership. However, traditional service learning has also attracted criticism for potentially reinforcing power hierarchies within society, alongside a failure to interrogate the imbalances of power that can exist within service learning as well. So it's suggested that it runs the risk of reinforcing an us-them dichotomy between students and the communities they engage with, and that without attending to the wider causes of social inequality, service learning can instead perpetuate and reinforce structural injustice. And moreover, traditional service learning primarily remains focused on improving students' educational outcomes, with a shift in emphasis away from attending to social issues, while, as this quote says, democratic outcomes at best remain byproduct, not actually being specifically attended to. So in response, there's this a critical service learning framework has been proposed. And critical service learning programs encourage students to see themselves as agents of social change and use the experience of service to address and respond to injustice in communities. And critical approaches to service learning are influenced by the work of Paulo Freire, the quote I gave you at the beginning, whose seminal text, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, highlights the transformative potential of education to empower students to develop critical literacy, thereby enabling them to address oppression and injustice. And building on this, a critical service learning approach highlights the need to address issues of power, and for both students and for instructors to develop a critical consciousness. So critical service learning is distinguished by a shift in focus away from this disposition of learning to serve, serving to learn, embedded within traditional service learning, and towards a three-part focus on a social change in orientation, working to redistribute power and developing authentic relationships. And Wade suggests that this critical service learning orientation can be understood as a need to envision service towards an ideal rather than towards an individual. And this is really focusing service learning on social. So when discussing social transformation, Freire highlights the need for there to be a reciprocal link between action and reflection, which is something he refers to as praxis. And he says liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it. And really importantly, he stresses that one without the other will be insufficient for any meaningful transformation of social inequality and social injustice. He also stresses the need for a leveling out of the teacher-student relationship, as opposed to this traditional emphasis on the kind of all-knowing teacher who's imparting knowledge to students who are just receptacles for knowledge, something that he calls the banking model of education. And instead, he emphasized dialogue and mutual meaning making. And he suggests we achieve this through what he calls problem-posing education. So I'll come back to in a couple of moments. And his underlying point is that we need to be thinking through issues with communities affected. As he says, revolutionary leaders cannot think without the people or for the people, but only with the people. So turning to practice then, as this kind of connection of action and reflection, I want to talk first about action, so what our students do. So they all involve 100 hours of community service with an organisation. And this extended involvement allows for a progressively deeper understanding of social issues and the need for social change. So they gain insight and experience in areas such as social justice, community development, environmental conservation, the provision of care, human rights, advocacy, community capacity building and activism. And so a major critique of traditional service learning is that student roles and activities are designed primarily with the needs of the student rather than the communities in addressing the social issues they face, and that the work that the students performs lacks the depth to lead to any kind of transformative experience. So instead, what is needed is the development of projects that challenge students to investigate and understand the root causes of social problems and the courses of action necessary to challenge and change the structures that perpetuate these problems. With all of this in mind, internship roles are designed by the community organisations to address a specific need or task, rather than, the interns going there to help out or just to kind of be there. And so our staff work with our community partners to ensure that roles enable students to engage with the complexity of the issues that the organisation and the community they serve are facing. And research also shows that for service learning to be effective and useful for the communities that the students engage with, the communities themselves need to take precedence in identifying these and in order to enable this kind of genuine partnership between the community and the student. So within our programme, it is the community partner that defines the parameters of the role. So first of all, the community organisation identifies the needs. They approach us. We're not approaching them. The community partners identify the parameters of the role, thereby avoiding the criticism that service learning is just another way that those with power and privilege define the solutions for those with less privilege. So it's the community organisations that are telling us what they want us to do, what they need. And finally, and crucially, it's the community partners that evaluate the students' involvement, their engagement and performance, with these evaluations forming part of the students' requirements. So this devolution of power, involving community partners as key stakeholders in developing and evaluating a student service is crucial to refocusing critical service learning away from these purely educational outcomes towards the wider community. And to accomplish this, we do provide wraparound support for students and for organisations. And I'll discuss those if you have questions afterwards. Thinking then about the theory and reflection. So reflection rooted in theory is the other key component. So all students, to start with, they do a 2-hour introduction to active citizenship, which we've been doing this week, prior to commencing their internships, where they're introduced to areas of social need, locally and globally, alongside key concepts, things like privilege, cultural difference, social justice. And this is followed by a 2-hour interactive Aboriginal cultural awareness training session provided by a local member organisation designed to introduce students to Aboriginal history and culture and help them to critically engage with the issues the Aboriginal community face. They also attend seminars in the middle and at the end of their internship. And prior to this, they have to complete readings, watch recordings of TED Talks and lectures that address things like social justice issues, concepts like social capital, social exclusion, structural disadvantage, and the seminars themselves are student-centered. The instructor facilitating discussion through problem posing and assisting the students to connect these key concepts with their experiences within their internships. And students will also ask to address these collective journals, all of which allow students to consider their service in the context of wider social issues and the need for social change. The reflection is a key tool by which students can explore issues of power and begin to integrate their service experiences with the conceptual foundations that they're provided with in learning activities. And reflection is a part of all service learning programs, but it's often kind of outwards, focused on others without any kind of critical reflection on the students' own perceptions and biases and how this can shape their perspective. And so this kind of outward-looking reflection can actually counterproductively lead to a perpetuation of assumptions and oppression. So critical self-reflection is essential if students are to be able to examine their own role in both the exercise of power and privilege, as well as its transformation. So as such, the reflective journal entries are guided by questions that prompt students to consider the wider context of the social issues, as well as their own responses to. They're put into peer networks at the beginning, and these small groups are encouraged to check in regularly. So we ask to check in every week and to meet up and to talk so they can support each other. So they've got lots of different kind of spheres of support for this learner. And they can also take the internship as part of a broader minor in active citizenship, which kind of gives them space to further engage if they are interested and if they are enjoying these issues. Like I was saying, Ray highlights this need for what he calls a problem-posing education. And what this means is basically just presenting issues as a problem. And he explains this by saying, students, as they're increasingly faced with problems relating to themselves in the world and with the world, will feel increasingly challenged and obliged to respond to that challenge. And because they apprehend the challenge as interrelated to other problems within a total context, and not a theoretical question, the resulting comprehension tends to be and their response to the challenge evokes new challenges, followed by new understandings, and gradually the students come to regard themselves as committed. So what does this look like? And I've just got some very kind of minor examples of the kind of things that we might be showing students as a problem. So initially, we introduce students to concepts like privilege, structural disadvantage, social capital, and then we'll work through problems. So if you look at this, this is Marshall's three-part definition of citizenship. You know, we'll talk through this and then we'll ask which groups have barriers accessing these rights within our community. And students go, oh, well, we've all got those rights. But once they actually start sitting down and talking through them, they actually start to kind of figure out, well, maybe that isn't the case. And maybe there are barriers. And you might ask, what does social inclusion look like? You'll look at these and say, well, why are these pictures looking like this? You know, how else could you label these? What do these concepts mean? How would you conceptualize? This, you know, we talk about what is privilege. How do different forms of privilege intersect with each other? How does having privilege benefit people? And it's very easy to assume that students are all very kind of woke and they know everything. They very rarely actually get a space in which they can actually talk about these issues, especially with you know, instructors and in these kind of guided safe spaces. And so really importantly, they're all student-led and student-focused. Which brings us back to this assertion that you can't think without the people nor for the people, but only with the people. I'm just going to show you just briefly some feedback from our surveys. So this is supervisor feedback, and again, it's overwhelmingly positive. And they're very kind of indicative. Each round we get this very, very positive response from our partners. When I say supervisors, I mean the supervisors in the organisation, so our community partners. And this is some of our student feedback, and again, overwhelmingly positive. So quite a lot of our interns carry on volunteering. Stay with the organisations, they keep on, and every round we always have a couple that get a job or that have some kind of project because they're doing, you know, that they're loving what they do. And we have a minor in active citizenship, which I've mentioned a couple of times, which allows them to extend the study and engagement. And I'd be happy to talk through any of this afterwards. And like I said, we are setting up some more targeted research. But we need to go through ethics first, which kind of looks at the development of critical consciousness. So we'll hopefully have some more data around this. And again, these are just some quotes from students. And like I said, for a lot of students, surprisingly, it is the first time they've critically engaged with community issues. It's the first time they've sat down to talk about things like social justice. And what I find is that students often feel incredibly disempowered. They're overwhelmed by the extent of the social issues that we face. They're overwhelmed by the environment, and there's a sense of helplessness for a lot of young people. And it's hard to imagine unless if for someone who's my age, or, you know, having grown up where this is all they've actually known. So having this space where they can actually critically think about and talk about these issues, it can be really empowering. And for some students, it can be really transformational. And these are just a couple of word clouds, the questions from those surveys. The first one is, what was the most significant thing you learned that you were previously unaware of? And the second is the blue one. How do you think your internship experience will change the way that you contribute to society? What I like about this, and what kind of really stood out to me, is that the number one thing is community. This is the thing that is sticking with students. They're actually feeling part of the community. They're actually feeling empowered as part of the community. So just to sum up then, critical service learning, it offers great potential for engaging students with social justice issues. So through the combination of guided critical reflection and community service, it encourages students to examine, as Mitchell states, both the historical precedents of the social problems addressed in their service placements and the impact of their personal action or inaction in maintaining and transforming those problems. And this is a quote from the Honourable Malcolm McCusker, who's chair of the McCusker Charitable Foundation. And he was discussing the founding of the centre, and he said, we want people who have a passion for justice, that is social justice, in our community, and at least some understanding of what needs there are. And so this combination of community action with critical reflection on the structural issues underpinning the social need, through this, we're aiming to help students to develop a critical consciousness, to be effective in working to transform social inequality. And it's not an outcome, it's a process. We don't get them there. It's not like we're like, yeah, we've got all these students there. It's not a destination. It's not somewhere we're taking them to. It's a journey, and hopefully one that we hope is going to be a lifelong journey, which we help them to either begin or to continue. A lot of them are already, engaged. And we can't guarantee that every student leaves with a full, thorough understanding of community need and social justice, but we do make an impact. And we also know that this work with students is essential if we're going to build the kind of communities that we need to effectively tackle the issues we face at local, regional, and global levels. I will stop there and leave anything else for questions. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Catherine O'Byrne that's not me. I'm Kirsten. No, she's the first name on the thing. So this is Catherine's work. I'm just presenting it because I happen to be based in WA and part of the same team. So I will not take any credit for what I am presenting today. This is all Catherine's work and Anne. But as a recent recruit to the Smith family, I'll be getting involved with some more of these bits and pieces about. I also pay respect to the Whadjuk Noongar people of WA. It's where I've woken up, worked, and will rest tonight, as many of us will, and particularly pay respects to elders present and the ones particularly who are supporting us at the Smith work. The Smith family is a national organisation. I'll talk a little bit about our scope and reach in a second. The team I work with is predominantly in Sydney. And we focus on supporting education for children and students from disadvantaged backgrounds. I'm sure many of us are familiar with these sorts of statistics, but education is effective for students from disadvantaged backgrounds throughout the entire educational course, and these disadvantages compound over time. So a third of children living in disadvantaged communities will start school developmentally vulnerable on at least one of the vulnerability domains in the AEDCs, whether that's physical, social, emotional vulnerabilities. And we know that, you know what NAPLAN results look like as kids progress through school. Example there, 1 in 5 Indigenous Year 5 students are below the national minimum standards for reading. This changes depending on what year you're looking at. Moving forward to the end of school, Year 12 completion rates are significantly lower for students from lower CS backgrounds and higher CS backgrounds, and then affects what sort of choices and opportunities they have beyond that. So we know that students from higher CS backgrounds are much more likely to attend university life course opportunities. In turn, that offers up. So the Smith family, sorry about that logo, it's a bit of a double up. We aim to address these things through 3 main pillars of support that we offer families and students. One is financial support. So this is money for educational supplies, for textbooks, uniforms, shoes, you know, whatever needs families have to support education for students. For primary students, it's a few $100s a year. Secondary students, a few extra $100s a year. And we also have tertiary scholarships for young people, and that's a few $1,000s a year. That helps really with those academic textbooks. The second pillar is personal support, and this is particularly important for the thing that I'm talking about today. So every family has a family partnership coordinator or an FPC. That person is has somewhere between 400 and 600 students that they're supporting. And what that support looks like depends on the family and what their needs are, what communities they're in. So it could be some families don't have a great history themselves with education, and they don't have great relationships with the school that their kids are attending. But the family partnership coordinators work very hard at maintaining partnerships with the schools that these students are in. It's very community based that way, and trying to help get conversations going that support the students for whatever their needs are at school. It could also be things like housing pops up as an issue for the family, which in turn is going to affect whether or not kids are going to school. So we can't provide direct housing support, but we might be able to link them into another service or know about other things that are happening in the community that can help. The third pillar is practical support, and this is really through a range of programs that have been developed over time. Runs a span from kindergarten through the tertiary space. So in the early years, it's a lot about literacy and numeracy programs. Through primary school, there are homework and learning clubs, and through high school, things like mentoring, career supports, work opportunities. We call it. I've lost my words. End of the day, work experience, and connecting them with organisations that they might not otherwise have pathways into. So these are the 3 bits that all work together to try and start shifting some of these educational experiences and outcomes for students. And just quickly, so this program is called Learning for Life. It's a scholarship name. At the moment, it's supporting 59,000 students nationally in about 35,000 families. They're all low-income families, about 20% Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. We have a lot of either our students or caregivers or both with health and disability issues, particularly mental health issues. 70% are not in the labour force or unemployed, and lots of things that we're very familiar with, and 15% don't have digital access at home. It's another part of the support that we try and offer is getting laptops for students and also getting them internet. So we've got a partnership with Optus trying to get internet packages for students as well. That's what we do. So for the family partnership coordinators especially, having timely access to the students' educational data is really critical for their role, in order to sort of fulfil the way we work. So the family practice framework is really about developing those relationships with families, supporting them with the needs that they have, and providing that needs is knowing about what's going on for that family. So I said they're supporting 400 to 600 students at any particular time. That's a lot. A lot of those families don't need any support. They're totally fine. They just have a light touch check-in throughout the year, and that's fine. Others need a bit more support. But a lot of the time, our FPCs don't know who's who at a point in time. We do collect data each year for our Learning for Life students on school attendance and achievement to see how they're tracking. But the way this works is we get to the end of the school year, we ask the family for a school report. It might get uploaded a few months later, and then by the time the FPC is looking at it, we're talking about data that's a year to 18 months out of date and pretty much useless in terms of identifying family needs as they're happening. So there's a considerable lag. Things are likely to have escalated in the meantime. You've got a student who's disengaging from school for whatever reason, and that tends to be getting worse. There's also a significant proportion where we don't receive that data either because they're not providing the reports or our systems just can't capture the data properly. The education departments have all of this data. It's up to date, it's timely, it's accurate, it's consistent, which is not what we get typically in our data collections. And the other piece, which I'll sort of come back to at the end as well. So my job, I'm the National Manager for Research and Evaluation. My job is to see if we make a difference. Are we actually shifting outcomes? It's a really hard job to do when you don't have the right data, you don't have timely data, and you have no comparison data. So this is something that sort of held back our ability to answer those questions about what impact did we make. And so we haven't had a comparable data set. So these are the things that are getting in our way at the moment. But the Department for Education of South Australia has really come through for us. So over the last 2 years or so, they've been working with us to develop a data dashboard that our FPCs, our family partnership coordinators, can access. This gives them real-time daily information on how students are tracking in terms of their attendance, if they've been suspended, behavioural issues, their latest grades, those sorts of things. And so this is getting timely data into the hands of our FPCs so they can make decisions about who needs support at a particular point in time. We've partnered with South Australia. Most of the departments have strong data cultures, honestly, and infrastructure. But really it's about the long-standing relationships that they've had with key people at the Smith family. Getting this data it sounds so simple, it's a data dashboard. You put data in, people access it, it's easy. Actually required cabinet approval and a change to legislation to enable this. And so, having worked in data linkage projects for a long time, this just really amazes me. So they got the legislation changed to include non-government organisations in part of the South Australian data sharing framework, specifically for this project. This process also required gaining consent for our Learning for Life families. So in South Australia, there's about 6,000 students in about 3,500 families. So this was an individual one-on-one conversation with a primary caregiver from every family to say, this is what we want to do. Do you consent to this process? And for the people that we managed to speak to, 95% of them agreed to this data sharing process. The dashboard itself was co-designed. So the department really took the lead on that. It's all within their system. They host it, they run it for us. But they had to liaise with a lot of people within the Smith family, not just research and advocacy, but also our policy team and the operations team, the FPCs themselves, about what's helped with them, what they need to see. And this relationship is continually evolving. So we get feedback from the FPCs about what works, what doesn't work, things get updated, and they're continuing to change. A quick snapshot of what it looks like. I won't go into a lot of detail because it's a dashboard. It looks like a dashboard. The FPCs can filter for particular things that they need to look at for the families that are in their particular group, for a year level, for a particular school that they're working in. And it just gives a very simple information, about students who have attendance less than 69%, for example. That might be the group that they want to target for a particular point. This data is also used we have program coordinators, so that third pillar of our support is the programs. This sort of data is used by them to understand particularly students who might be eligible for different scholarships that are offered by different organisations. So they might be able to pick out some high achievers who are tracking really well and forward them for consideration for those scholarships. They might identify students who are really struggling with literacy in particular and identify them for a literacy program that we offer. So the organisation calls this dashboard a game changer. So it's taken 18 months, it's closer to 2 years now, of highly collaborative work. And it went live about a year ago. So it's been running for a year. We have plans to evaluate the, getting data and what that does for practice in terms of how that shifts outcomes. But we have continually sought feedback from people who use the dashboard about how that's working. Just as a bit of a plug, it was submitted as one of the Australian Financial Review does best innovations every year. We came third in the category that we were in this year, which is a great recognition. So families are very supportive. So as I said, 95% provided informed consent, and that means we've had translators for families from non-English speaking backgrounds to have those conversations. We didn't get a very consistent response for the 5% about why they weren't consenting. There weren't particular groups overrepresented in that. It was just I don't like the sound of that, no thanks. And so FPCs tell us that the way that they use the data to provide that timely touch points with families, that they're grateful for any additional support that they can provide and offer to their children at the time that it's needed. It's used pretty well. So we have 29 team members in South Australia who are using it. So we've got the family partnership coordinators, the program coordinators. I mentioned they sort of help pick who might be suitable for different programs. And the 4 team leaders who kind of manage all of those teams use it to help have professional development discussions with their team as well. Most of the FPCs are using the dashboard daily or weekly. Not everyone. Some have taken a little bit longer to get on board. And often when they do start using it, it's because they sort of look over to the next desk and say, what are you doing there? And how are you using this? And they sort of see the practice example and how other FPCs are using it to support their families. The FPCs tell us that the real use for them is that it helps to start a conversation. So it's not all about identifying problems. A lot of it is about identifying success and celebrating that. It's a really great reason to pick up a phone and call a family and say, look, I see Jimmy has, improved their attendance this term compared to last term. That's really great. What's happened there? So they can learn from that as well, that they might be able to apply some things to some different families. We focus a lot on transition points, particularly the transition from primary into high school. It's a risk of stuff going wrong with engagement in particular. So having conversations with families about the real strengths of the students that they're supporting and potentially areas of improvement. The attendance is really clear. They can see when that's starting to become affected, so they can start to understand issues if attendance is a problem for just one student. That's going to require a different approach to if all of the students in the family are having some problems. It's really helpful to re-engage with families who've moved home. So the way students come into the Smith family, they get referred by our partner schools. So we have partnerships with particular schools. Students in those schools will get referred to us, but often they'll move and they'll leave that school. They'll still stay on our program. They don't always tell us when they move. So sometimes we lose them, but by having them in the dashboard, we can see, oh, they're actually in this school now, and they can start to follow up and say what's going on with that. So the last piece I just wanted to mention were the research data sets. So apart from this timely, nice dashboard stuff that the department has given us, they're also providing us with some research data sets to help address these questions that we've had for a very long time of, do we make a difference? So we've what they're giving us is all of that education data in a nice packaged data set that includes pre-data. So, you know, attendance, achievement, all of those sorts of things before they came onto the Learning for Life program, as well as after. So we can see what sort of change happens before and after. The problem with that is most of our students come on in year one. So we don't get a lot of that pre-data beforehand. But we also have a matched cohort. So they're giving us a 3-to-1 match of students who are not on Learning for Life, but look like Learning for Life students in terms of parent education, occupation, year level, school level advantage, these sorts of things. So it's not perfect, but it's the closest thing we've ever had to being able to make a solid comparison between our students and other similar students. We use these data sets mainly in 2 ways. The first is just to validate what we get through our usual business as usual practice. So what do we get in? So in South Australia, we can see that, you know, we might estimate our total attendance rate for our South Australian secondary students is about 85%. When we look at the ones that we're missing data for, it's actually closer to 80% because, you know, we're not getting the reports from the students with the lower attendance overall. So we get to understand what the reality is, I think, a bit better. But the second part is really being able to answer those 2 questions of, do education outcomes improve after students commence on Learning for Life? And then how do their attendance, achievement, or Year 12 completion outcomes compare between the 2 groups? Our initial analysis, our initial foray into the data is indicating we're not seeing a lot of difference in the attendance and achievement outcomes. We're trying to make sure we're setting the right models and the parameters and looking at that the right way. But initially, it looks like our Year 12 completion rates are a bit better than the matched cohort, which is a nice outcome for us. But again, needs some more work. We're still working with the department to get more data sets becoming available. As they're getting it, they're sharing it with us. And we're finally making progress now in Queensland and WA. So WA have been they've been developing some things that we're about to go look at in a couple of weeks, which is great. And Queensland, I think there's an MOU has been signed. So South Australia's been a great pilot. You know, it's starting to expand into other states. And taking what we've learned along the way and starting to apply that elsewhere. That's it.